A racist police officer wrongly assumed that a black man in the park was suspicious and ended up arresting an FBI agent. Marcus Davis sat peacefully on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun bathing the trees and grass in golden light. The distant sound of children laughing and leaves rustling created a tranquil atmosphere. For Marcus, this place was more than just a park. It was a quiet refuge from the pressure of his high-stakes job. He turned another page of the book he was reading, momentarily lost in the peace of the moment. But that calm didn't last across the park. Officer Brian Harkins made his usual rounds. After over 20 years of walking the same beat, he believed he knew this city better than anyone. When he spotted Marcus sitting alone, reading quietly, something in his gut told him something was off. A black man, alone, appearing too calm and composed. It triggered his internal alarms. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered to himself. He paused, watching Marcus from a distance. Recent reports mentioned a vague suspect that loosely fit Marcus's description. It wasn't much, but for Brian, it was enough to justify a closer look. Marcus, sensing eyes on him, glanced up from his book. He spotted Brian staring at him from across the way, wearing an expression Marcus had seen far too many times. Thinly veiled suspicion wrapped in the mask of authority. But Marcus didn't react with fear. He calmly closed his book, marking his place with a finger, and held Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. Something about Marcus's unwavering look unsettled him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," he muttered, walking toward the bench with measured steps. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. Marcus wasn't nervous. He wasn't defensive. That lack of fear felt threatening in itself. Marcus maintained a neutral expression as Brian approached. He knew exactly how encounters like this could spiral out of control, and he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. But he also wasn't about to let himself be intimidated. "Afternoon," Brian said when he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but underneath there was tension. "Afternoon," Marcus responded, his voice calm and clear. He kept his hands in view, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes flicking between Marcus's face and the book, clearly fishing for a reason to dig deeper. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus replied. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly, though he barely registered the response. He was more focused on what Marcus wasn't saying, on what he might be hiding beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Brian asked. Marcus offered a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been around." It wasn't the answer Brian was hoping for. His stance shifted, becoming more assertive. "Mind if I see some ID?" The smile vanished. Marcus recognized the moment things could turn dangerous. He knew he wasn't legally obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew how quickly a situation could escalate. Still, he refused to let fear dictate his actions. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked evenly, holding Brian's gaze. The calmness in Marcus's tone irritated Brian. It felt like a challenge, and he didn't like feeling challenged. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian snapped, his hand drifting toward his holster. Marcus inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said. "Is that illegal now?" Brian's patience was running thin. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though the excuse sounded flimsy even to him. He stepped closer, trying to assert dominance, but Marcus didn't move. He stayed rooted, his gaze unwavering. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw clenched. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it, but he wasn't about to back down. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID. Now!" A long pause passed between them. Marcus considered pushing back, standing his ground, but ultimately, he chose to de-escalate, for now. Wordlessly, he reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched like a hawk, every muscle tense. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it and glanced at the name. It meant nothing to him, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back. Marcus sighed to himself but obeyed. He rose slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a swell of frustration rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He turned around and let Brian cuff him without resistance. He could feel the eyes of park-goers on him as the cold metal locked around his wrists. He stayed calm. Anger would only make things worse. As Brian tightened the cuffs, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he might be making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. He grabbed Marcus's arm and began walking him toward the patrol car. Marcus stayed silent. He wasn't worried. He knew who he was, and soon enough, Officer Harkins would know too. Still, he couldn't help but feel a deep, exhausting weariness. No matter what he achieved, in the eyes of men like Brian, he was still just another black man who didn't belong. At the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The cuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as he sat, staring out the window. Trees passed in a blur as the car pulled away from the park. Another day? Another example of how quickly things could go wrong, for no good reason. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the rear-view mirror, his face unreadable. "I told you," he said calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his tone even. Brian faltered, realizing what he had just implied. But instead of walking it back, he pushed forward. "You just don't look like the type who spends afternoons with a book in the park," he muttered. Marcus didn't reply immediately. He let the silence stretch between them, thick with implication. Finally, he said, "And what exactly does someone like me look like, officer?" Brian couldn't answer, not honestly. He focused back on the road, frustration simmering beneath his uniform as Marcus's calm presence continued to get under his skin. They arrived at the precinct in tense silence. Brian parked near the entrance, got out, and opened the rear door. Marcus stepped out without a word, the cuffs still tight on his wrists. Inside, the precinct buzzed with its usual noise, phones ringing, officers chatting, paperwork shuffling. Brian led Marcus through the main hallway, past curious stares. He didn't explain, not yet. He needed to figure out how to justify the arrest before facing questions. At the booking desk, Officer Jenkins looked up. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Brian and Marcus. "What's this?" Jenkins asked. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian said quickly, handing over Marcus's ID. Jenkins examined it. For a moment, his expression shifted, recognition, but he quickly masked it and typed Marcus's information into the system. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said, returning the ID. "You'll want to bring him to her." Brian hesitated. Captain Laura Bennett was sharp and by the book, not someone to make excuses with, but he nodded. "All right." He turned to Marcus, gripping his arm again. "Let's go." As they approached the office, Marcus could feel the tension radiating off Brian. There was doubt now, cracks forming in the officer's confidence. Brian knocked, then entered when Bennett's voice gave permission. The captain looked up from her desk, her expression cool and unreadable. "Officer Harkins," she said, eyeing Marcus briefly. "What's this about?" "Caught him in the park. He was acting suspicious and wouldn't show ID," Brian explained. Bennett turned her full attention to Marcus. Her gaze lingered just long enough to confirm what Jenkins had suspected. She recognized him, but her face remained professional. "Is that so?" she asked. Marcus met her eyes. He knew she remembered him. She was waiting to see how far Brian would take this. "That's right," Brian continued. "I brought him in for questioning." "I see," Bennett said slowly. Did you have probable cause to arrest him? Brian's voice wavered slightly. He wouldn't cooperate, Captain. Bennett leaned back in her chair. Officer Harkins, step outside. I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone. Brian hesitated, but her tone left no room for argument. He stepped out, shutting the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Bennett's demeanor shifted. Mr. Davis, she said gently, I apologize for the misunderstanding. No need to apologize, Captain, Marcus replied with a faint smile. You're just doing your job. I know who you are, she said, but I'd appreciate it if we kept that quiet for now. I'll handle Officer Harkins. Of course, I'm not here to make trouble, Marcus said, but I do want things handled the right way. They will be, she assured him. But why didn't you tell him who you are? Marcus's expression hardened. Because it shouldn't matter. Respect shouldn't depend on my job title. Bennett nodded solemnly. You're right, but unfortunately, with some people, it does. She stood and walked to the door. Let me bring him back in. Marcus gave a small nod. The confrontation wasn't over, but he held the upper hand now. Brian's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Officer Harkins, my office. Now, Captain Bennett said, her voice firm and uncompromising. Brian stood immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that crept into his posture. He followed her down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. Once inside her office, Bennett closed the door and motioned for him to sit. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from her, feeling the weight of what was to come. Captain Bennett settled into her seat, took a steadying breath, and locked eyes with him. Officer Harkins, do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is? Brian blinked, surprised. No, Captain, just some guy in the park. Bennett leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Marcus Davis is not just some guy. He's a special agent. One of the FBI's top operatives. The words hit like a slap. Brian's breath caught as the magnitude of his mistake crashed over him. An FBI agent? He whispered. That's right, Bennett said, her tone unwavering. And not just any agent. One with an impeccable reputation and considerable respect inside the Bureau. This arrest is already being reviewed by federal authorities. The fallout won't just affect you, it will ripple through the entire precinct. Brian's thoughts raced. He had profiled and arrested a man based on assumption, an assumption rooted in bias. And now it was clear how wrong he had been. I didn't know, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the problem, Bennett said. It shouldn't have mattered. You didn't arrest him because you recognized him. You arrested him because of what you assumed. Brian swallowed hard, guilt creeping in behind his defensiveness. What happens now? For now, you're on administrative leave, she said. An internal review is underway, and federal oversight will likely follow. Depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, up to and including termination. The word hung in the air like a sentence. Termination. After 2 decades on the force. Brian looked down, unable to meet her gaze. I understand, Captain. Bennett's tone softened, but only slightly. This isn't just about you. It's about what your actions represent. We cannot afford officers who act on instinct rooted in prejudice. You swore to protect the community, not judge it. Brian gave a silent nod, his throat tight with the weight of regret. He had spent his career believing he was doing the right thing, but now everything he believed about himself as a cop felt uncertain. You're dismissed, Officer Harkins, Bennett said. We'll inform you when your review is scheduled. He stood with difficulty, murmured a thank you, and left the office. The familiar sounds of the precinct now felt distant and foreign. As he walked to his car, the weight of what had happened pressed down harder with each step. He had worn the badge for over 20 years, but now he questioned whether he ever deserved it at all. What exactly was suspicious about his behavior? Bennett asked, her tone neutral but probing. Brian hesitated, aware that his answer mattered now more than ever. He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. Evasive how? Bennett pressed. He didn't want to show me his ID right away, Brian replied, though even to his own ears the justification felt flimsy. It seemed like he was hiding something. Marcus's voice cut in, calm, steady, but unmistakably sharp. I was reading a book, Officer Harkins. Not exactly what you'd call criminal behavior. Brian flinched slightly at the comment, then turned his attention back to Bennett. I was just doing my job, Captain. Trying to protect the community. Did you find anything on Mr. Davis that suggested he was involved in a crime? Bennett asked. Brian slowly shook his head. No, ma'am. He was clean. Silence hung thick in the room as everyone absorbed that statement. Then one of the internal affairs officers leaned forward, voice firm. Officer Harkins, did it occur to you that Mr. Davis might have been telling the truth? Brian hesitated, searching for words that might redeem him. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume a threat until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been based on something other than training? The officer asked, his tone pointed. Brian swallowed hard. I didn't mean to profile him. I was just doing what I thought was right. Marcus leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Brian. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Harkins, not to judge people by their appearance. Brian wanted to push back, to explain, to defend himself, but guilt flooded in too fast to resist. He knew Marcus was right. Deep down, he had known it even at the park. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, reclaiming the room's focus. This review isn't only about what happened that day. It's about the mindset behind your choices. We need to ensure that everyone wearing this badge stands for fairness and justice. This is about more than one officer. It's about the integrity of the whole department. Brian felt the weight of those words settle into his chest like stone. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a reckoning. I understand, Captain, he murmured. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want it to go this way. We all make mistakes, Harkins, Bennett replied, her voice even but firm. But how we deal with them, that defines who we really are. Another silence fell. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice steady, clear, and full of quiet authority. Captain Bennett, may I say something? Bennett nodded. Of course, Mr. Davis. Marcus stood, his presence commanding even in this room of senior officers. He looked directly at Brian, no hatred in his eyes, only firm resolve. I understand that law enforcement is difficult, the pressure, the responsibility, but we cannot let that pressure justify injustice. What happened to me is just one example. It's not about punishment, it's about preventing this from happening again. Brian listened, the words landing heavy. I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, Marcus continued, but I do want to make sure that the next time someone like me is approached, the officer doesn't assume the worst, that they pause, ask questions, and truly listen. That's how change begins. Bennett nodded, her voice thoughtful. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your words are on the record. Marcus returned to his seat. His eyes remained on Brian, firm but not vindictive. Bennett turned back to Brian. Officer Harkins, you'll remain on leave as we complete the review. Use this time to reflect. We'll reconvene soon to determine next steps. Brian nodded numbly. Yes, Captain. As the room emptied, Brian remained seated for a long moment, his mind spiraling. He had entered hoping to defend himself, but now all he could think about was how wrong he'd been. He glanced one last time at Marcus. Their eyes met briefly. In Marcus's gaze there was no triumph, only a deep and resolute sense of justice. Brian looked away first, overwhelmed by the quiet truth staring back at him. Yeah, Bennett said, leaning back in her chair. Let's see if he's ready to talk more openly about what happened. Harper nodded and left the office, leaving Bennett alone with the case file. She flipped it open and began reading the latest witness statements. They echoed what she had already seen. Brian had approached aggressively from the start. Marcus had clearly been trying to de-escalate, but his attempts had been ignored. As she read, a heavy unease settled in her chest. She had known Brian Harkins for years. He had always been a solid officer, dependable, respected. But now, she was seeing a side of him that had never surfaced before, and it was troubling. The hours passed slowly as Bennett combed through reports, statements, and the damning body cam footage. Finally, there was a knock at the door. Harper entered, followed by Brian. Come in, Harkins, Bennett said, her voice neutral. Brian looked tired, worn. He took a seat across from her, stealing a nervous glance at Harper. His shoulders were tight, hands clasped tightly together. We're going to walk through the events again, Bennett said. I need you to be completely honest this time. I understand, Brian said, though his voice was thin. Harper led the questioning. Walk us through what you were thinking when you first saw Marcus Davis in the park. Brian hesitated. He fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a tense situation, and I had to act quickly. What made you so sure he was the one? Harper asked. He matched the general description, black male, average build. He seemed like he was trying to avoid attention. Bennett listened closely. Brian's tone had shifted, not defensive but unsure, like he was grasping for justifications that even he didn't believe anymore. Brian, the witness statements and body cam show that Mr. Davis was calm, cooperative, and clearly tried to explain himself, Bennett said. You didn't listen, you escalated. Brian shifted in his seat. He was trying to stall me. I thought, at the time, I was following my training. Your training doesn't excuse racial profiling, Bennett snapped, her patience thinning. You made a choice, a biased one, and it led to an unjust arrest. Brian opened his mouth, then shut it again. He knew she was right. I didn't mean to cause harm, he finally said. That was never my intention. Intent doesn't erase the damage, Bennett said quietly. It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did. Before Brian could respond, there was another knock. Harper opened the door, revealing Marcus Davis. He entered with his usual quiet confidence, greeting the room with a nod. Thank you for coming, Mr. Davis, Bennett said, standing to shake his hand. Of course, Captain, Marcus replied, taking a seat beside Brian. We'd like to hear your account again, Harper said. Marcus nodded. I was enjoying my day off in the park. Officer Harkins approached me aggressively, assumed I was hiding something, and ignored everything I said. I told him I worked for the FBI. I tried to show him my credentials, but he dismissed me. I was treated like a criminal for no reason. Brian's shoulders slumped. He kept his eyes on the floor. Do you believe his actions were influenced by your race? Harper asked. Absolutely, Marcus said without hesitation. It was obvious from the start. He saw me and made a decision, not based on behavior, based on appearance. Bennett watched the impact of Marcus's words land on Brian. The older officer looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. Thank you, Mr. Davis, she said. We appreciate your clarity. Marcus stood, but before leaving, he turned to Brian. I don't hate you, Officer Harkins, he said calmly, but I hope you understand the harm that came from what you did. Intent doesn't erase consequence. I hope you learn from this. With that, he left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Bennett looked at Brian. This isn't just about finding out what happened. It's about ensuring it never happens again. Brian nodded slowly. He had no defense left, only the weight of regret. Underlying factors like this need to be addressed, or incidents like this will just keep happening, Marcus said. Bennett nodded, appreciating Marcus's candor. I agree. This case has highlighted the urgent need for systemic change, and I'm committed to that. We've already begun revising our training programs to include deeper education on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We're also implementing stronger oversight and accountability measures. That's a good start, Marcus replied, a note of cautious approval in his voice. But it can't just be policy changes on paper. The culture needs to shift. Officers need to feel responsible not just for enforcement, but for equity. Bennett's expression was thoughtful. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. People like you help drive that progress. Marcus gave a small nod. I'm willing to help however I can. This isn't just about me. It's about preventing the same experience for the next person. A few days later, the department held a closed-door meeting with community leaders, officers, and legal advisors. The goal was to lay the groundwork for a broader initiative, one that went beyond apologies and acknowledgments. The department would begin conducting monthly reviews of use of force incidents, create a civilian oversight board, and establish mandatory anti-bias retraining. Brian Harkins, still on administrative leave, watched the announcements unfold from a distance. He had not returned to work, nor had he been cleared to. Instead, he spent his days reflecting, truly reflecting, for the first time in his career. He reread training manuals with new eyes, listened to community-led podcasts, and even reached out to a therapist. He wasn't sure if he would return to the force. He wasn't sure if he should. But for the first time, he wasn't focused on defending himself. He was focused on understanding. One morning, he received a letter in the mail. It was from Marcus Davis. Inside was a short handwritten note. Accountability is hard, but necessary. If you're willing to grow, I respect that. We don't need perfect officers. We need honest ones. Marcus. Brian read the letter twice, then a third time. Something shifted inside him. Not relief, not forgiveness, but responsibility. Weeks later, a press conference was held. Captain Bennett stood before cameras and reporters, outlining the department's new direction. Beside her stood Marcus Davis, not as a victim, but as a partner in reform. I didn't ask to be a symbol, Marcus said to the crowd, but if my experience can help make change, I'll use it. This isn't about one person. It's about building a system where fairness isn't a privilege. It's the standard. The crowd applauded. Flashbulbs went off, and somewhere in the back, Brian watched quietly, his face unreadable, but his eyes open finally to what justice really meant.